Adat Shalom, everyone. I want to start by sharing that over the past couple of months, I've been making random phone calls to members of the congregation. If you haven't gotten your phone call yet, it's either because you don't have a current number listed with us or because you're lower in the alphabet. Please don't worry about it. I'm not telling this story to make anyone worry that they won't get their call eventually. I am telling this story to say that one of the things that happens when I make these calls is invariably people think I'm kind of taking attendance on Shabbat. And they're like, I'm sorry, Rabbi, like I haven't been there. I feel really bad about it. I'm like, I'm not calling to make you feel bad. I don't really mind what you do. I'm just here to say, how are you doing? How you been? It's been like a really crazy couple of years, and we want to know how you're doing. So one of the things that people have said about how they're doing is if they were someone who used to come to shul and hasn't found their way back, they say, I really miss it, and I don't know how to come back. I don't know what it looks like to get into that rhythm or out of the rhythm that I've found in this new life. And yet a part of me longs to be there. And I think that this is actually somewhat essential to this moment. It's not just a story about shul and attendance and how you show up in your Jewish life. We have been really disorganized over the past couple of years. And in some ways, the things that have risen to the surface in terms of what we do and how we spend our time are more intentional. And in other ways, they're a weird mix of adaptations that might be maladaptations. And what they will bring to our lives is a little bit to be seen. We don't know. And I was thinking about this today because we call this Shabbat, Shabbat Chazon, a Shabbat of vision. Chazon comes from the beginning of the Haftorah that was just chanted so beautifully by Paul Meiji. And Chazon is translated as prophecy. Prophecy is vision, it's true. But I want to dig down a little bit deeper about two aspects of vision and use both today's parsha from the book of Devarim and also the story of Tisha B'Av in order to talk a little bit deeper about what vision is and what allows us to live with vision. Vision, prophecy is not, I would say, predicting the future. It's being open to the reality that the future is actually unknown. And what's so powerful about that is that we often tell a story about human life that history repeats itself. How many times have you yourself said that? Looked at the news cycle, looked at the world around you and said, oh, it's just history repeating itself. I feel so powerless against this. And it's true. History in some ways does repeat itself. We in our own individual lives live the same challenges again and again and often make the same mistakes. And in that way, history repeats itself. And the same is true for society. We face the same challenges again and again. And invariably, we often make the same mistakes. That's human nature. But it's also potential. It's also possible to take new pathways. And that's where I want to look at the story of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, technically today, the 9th of Av, though we'll observe it starting tonight, is when we observe the mourning surrounding the destruction and loss of the temple and the whole way of life that ancient Israelites associated with the temple. We mourn, we sing dirge-like piyutim, and we feel the sadness and the intensity of loss. Whether it's for the past or connecting to something in your present that has been suffering and difficult, This is the space in the calendar where we actually go there. We allow ourselves to. That said, Tisha B'Av is not only a tragic story. The Judaism that we live grows from Tisha B'Av. The end of the story of Tisha B'Av, as Jerusalem is being destroyed, tells the story of Rabbi Shimon not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. No, whoops. Forgot. It's okay. I'll tell you later. Okay, this rabbi, whose name I'm embarrassingly forgetting, that's okay, you can see that I don't know everything, who leaves Jerusalem in a casket in order to escape the city that's being destroyed. And he goes on to found Yavna, which becomes the seat of the codification of rabbinic Judaism. Now, what did I just say? Those were like 10 big words that made no sense. So I'm going to back it up one step and say, we are rabbinic Jews. We follow the interpretation that the rabbis of old bring to the written Torah that we just read from. So when we read what the Torah says, we practice through the lens and the understanding of the rabbis. And that process is all about the loss of the way of life that we had in Jerusalem. And the rabbis saying, there is a way through this. There is a way that we can incorporate what we've had and continue something that shares a thread with what was, but is really different. And in terms of that idea that history repeats itself, we actually have in it always this possibility of creating something new. And I think in some ways it's harder to admit that the future is unknown and in some ways in our hands than it is to say that history repeats itself. History repeats itself, there's nothing we can do. We are supposed to be visionary and shaping the future. That is an enormous responsibility. So the rabbis of old, our ancestors, took that responsibility upon them and began the process of writing, of first expounding on what's called the oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah that is in the mouth. It's an oral tradition. They expounded on the Torah, they explained the things that the written Torah said, they made sense of it, they argued over it, and they also transformed what was a temple-based service into our prayers, and really, in many ways, our way of life. And they also, over time, wrote that down. That oral Torah got written down. And every time that it gets written down, it gets expanded again by the next generation, because Judaism, it turns out, is not one singular thing. It's actually a process. Torah is a process and a lens that we bring to the world. And I think if you really let that sink in, you can feel the truth in that. Because we are not literalists in our tradition. We are interpreters. And the Torah is the law interpreted. That brings us to a somewhat different story, Parshat Devarim, which opens with a statement that says, Eila Devarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe addressed to all Israel. I don't know if you hear it, but across the generations, this has actually been a very troubling statement because it holds in it the possibility that Moshe is the speaker and the creator of Torah and not God. Now, I am not introducing that. Many commentators before me have asked, how do we square this seeming contradiction, which is that we know that the Torah comes from God, and yet we have in it, in this moment, the idea that Moshe is a part of that creative process. That seems really problematic. But what is the story I just told you? That actually over Jewish history, again and again, we have worked in concert with God, in concert with God's vision for who we are how we live in the world as Jews, and how we express Torah. And what's so beautiful is that multiple medieval commentators, medieval rabbis, pick up on this line in Torah, and they say, wait a second, how do I square this with my understanding that the Torah comes from God? Oh, maybe this is Moshe expounding and explaining to us in a way that we can understand God's Torah. Maybe this, Parshat Devarim, which is also called Mishnah Torah, the repetition or the second Torah. Maybe this is Moshe's, the first seed of what becomes Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. That need for humans to not just have static law, but also interpretation, meaning, relevance. So in these two stories, you can see that on the one hand, our tradition has a thread that can be carried across time. That the Torah, in essence, is unbreakable, and yet is also mutable and changeable. And when we really lean into what the possibility of Shabbat Chazon can be, I believe there's an invitation in that. An invitation for us each to trust the future, which is incredibly scary. But it's also required of us, because if we're not going to repeat the past, if we're not going to fall into that axiom where you say, what is stupidity? It's doing the same thing again and again. We're not going to do that. But you know what? It's actually way harder to do things differently. And that, I believe, is the invitation of our rabbis. That's the invitation of Shabbat Chazon. And look, even today, in our shul, we managed to do something differently, right? These high holidays, we will do things differently. And yet they will carry the thread of tradition, the thread of Torah, the thread of truth and meaningful lives through. And I feel so grateful to do that work in community, to be brave together as we look to an unknown future, and continue that work of showing up every day for something that is both very old and also new. Shabbat Shalom.